Hello, everybody. In this video lecture, we will cover chapter 27. It might be a different chapter in your textbook, but the point is this is reproductive system, physiology of the reproductive system, and specifically the female reproductive system. So let's go ahead and begin. So oogenesis. Oogenesis is production of ova or oocytes, right? So we call it eggs, right? But of course, correct name is ova, that's plural, and ovum is singular. So oogenesis begins in a fetal period, and it starts with a stem cells that is called oogonia, and it's a diploid cell, so 2N or 46 chromosomes. Oogonia multiply by mitosis and store nutrients. Primary oocytes develop in primordial follicles that become surrounded by follicle cells. So then primary oocyte begins meiosis, but stall in prophase 1, and at birth, female presumed to have lifetime supply of primary oocytes. So instead of just going over this PowerPoint right now, let's look at this diagram. Diagram makes sense, and then you can go back and read, everything about this process oogenesis. So if you look over here, right, what's shown here in blue, this is before birth, then infancy and childhood, and then after puberty, each month from puberty to menopause, right, in a female. Also, on this side, on your left, we will see what's happening with stem cells, right? How stem cell divide to form primary oocytes and secondary oocyte. But this stem cell is actually located within a follicle. So on the right side, on my right side, so on the right side, you will see what happened with follicle. So we have follicular cells that surrounding oocytes, and changes happen within oocyte and within follicle, right? So before birth, we start with oogonium or stem cells. Now, oogonium or oogonia divides by mitosis, so it keeps the same ploidy, so from 46 to 46, right? And when those stem cells divide and differentiate, they form this primary oocytes. So we have, good amount of primary oocytes, and those oocytes are surrounded by a simple layer of squamous cells. And those cells called follicle cells, forming the follicle that is called primordial follicle, and inside we have primary oocytes. All right, so actually within ovary, females do not have this primary oocytes on its own. All those primary oocytes are inside primordial follicles, right? Now, primary oocyte is formed by mitosis, so it has 2N number of chromosomes. Now then it starts dividing by meiosis during infancy, childhood, right? So it starts dividing by meiosis, but it does not finish this division. It's arrested in prophase 1, right? And so new research shows us that this kind of might happen in infancy, but before we always thought that this has happened before birth. So that's when we have primary oocytes that arrested in prophase 1, so that all happened before birth. And female is born with all primordial follicles and all the primary oocytes that will be present, kind of like you have the supply for the rest of your life until the menopause, right? But new research shows us that some of this process can happen after the birth, during infancy, childhood. So that's not, I mean, on your exam, I will not obviously ask you about these details because it's still not really clear. Right, but anyway, when primary oocyte divides by meiosis, it does not finish division and it's arrested in prophase 1 and it's located inside primordial follicle. Now, during puberty, from puberty to menopause, several primordial follicles are chosen, right? They receive endocrine signals from hormones and they finish up this division. They finish up meiosis, right? And they become, so meiosis 1 is completed. What is formed at the end of meiosis 1 is secondary oocyte that now is haploid. It has n number of chromosome, 23, and first polar body. Because when we're talking about spermatogenesis, all these primary spermatocytes, secondary spermatocytes, they have equal number of cytoplasm. So when they divide their nucleus and they divide cytoplasm. During oogenesis, all the cytoplasm stays with secondary oocyte, and first and second polar bodies, they just kind of get rid of extra chromosome, but they don't have lots of cytoplasm organelles because we want save everything for this oocyte to become ovum and hopefully develop into embryo, right? So after meiosis 1, secondary oocyte is formed and first polar body. Now, secondary oocyte enters meiosis 2, but it's arrested again. So it does not finish meiosis 2. It's arrested now in metaphase 2. And during ovulation, the secondary oocyte is ovulated, right? So it's not the ovum that is ovulated. That is really weird. But the secondary oocyte that actually already haploid, right? But it did not finish second round of division, meiosis 2. And it only finished this meiosis 2 if it fertilized by sperm. So after fertilization, it finished up meiosis 2 and forms the ovum and second polar body, right? At the same time, right, so this is what's happening with a cell, right, with stem cells that became primary oocyte and secondary oocyte and finally ovum. But remember, those cells are inside follicles. Now, what's happening with follicles? So this primordial follicle, we have squamous cells, follicle cells surrounding this oocyte. So that's primordial follicle. Then those squamous cells became cuboidal cells. And when they cuboidal, we call it now primary follicle. So during puberty, the primary follicles, primordial follicles receive signals, became primary follicles, and then secondary, vesicular, and finally corpus luteum. So squamous cells became cuboidal cells. Now we call it primary follicle. Then we have several layers of those cells, then it's a secondary follicle. Now in follicle, we start forming the fluid that separate the oocyte from the follicular cells. And when we have fluid, we have some a space inside, right? And this follicle is called vesicular or antral follicle. And then vesicular follicle became bigger, the antrum became larger, and the mature follicle is called a Graafian follicle. And you see here the ovulation happens. So secondary oocyte is ovulated. And whatever is left from this follicle became corpus luteum, and then it's degenerate, right? So the changes happen with the cells, germ cells, and with follicle. Now, another thing, we call it follicle cells when we have one layer of squamous cells. When they became cuboidal, and then we have several layers of them, we call them granulosa cells, right? Okay, so now let's see what we cover pretty much. So we cover here that primary oocytes develop in primordial follicle surrounding by follicle cells, right? We also said that primary oocytes begin meiosis but stall in prophase 1, right? Then we said that each month after puberty, a few primary oocytes are activated and one is selected and became dominant follicle that continues and finish up meiosis 1. After meiosis 1 is completed, 2 haploid cells are produced, secondary oocyte, right, and first polar body. So secondary oocyte are large cells with almost all of mother cell cytoplasm and organelles, and first polar body, small cells almost devoid of cytoplasm. Then secondary oocytes arrest in metaphase 2 and becomes ovulated ovum. If not penetrated by sperm, it deteriorates. If penetrated by sperm, secondary oocytes completes meiosis 2, yelling ovum, functional gamete, and second polar body, right? So again, look at this diagram, and this diagram is explained by previous slides, right? So now, because ovum develops inside the follicle, right, and all this process happen within ovaries, we call it ovarian cycle. So females have 2 cycles, ovarian cycle, right, and uterine cycle. So changes happen within ovaries and changes happen within uterus. And of course, all those changes are regulated by endocrine system, by specific hormones that we will cover in a minute. And 2 cycles need to be coordinated, right? Because when the oocyte is growing and dividing, when follicle is growing, when ovulation happens, we need to make sure that uterus is prepared for this ovulated oocyte and for possibly for ovum to be moved to the uterus, right, and develop, well, and zygote. So when ovum is fertilized, we form a zygote. So that zygote will grow into embryo, right? So uterus need to be prepared for ovulated oocyte, right? So that's why ovarian and uterine cycles need to match, right? So everything need to happen at a precise time. So timing need to be perfect. So let's see at the ovarian cycle first. So ovarian cycle monthly, about 28 days. It's a series of events associated with maturation of egg or ovum. So it will include the division of oocytes, formation of secondary oocyte, and also changes within follicle, right? From primary to secondary to vesicular follicle. So ovarian cycle include 2 consecutive phases, and ovulation is between those phases. So it's a follicular phase, period of vesicular follicle growth. So the follicle grow, that's why it's called follicular phase, day 1 through 14, then ovulation, and then luteal phase, a period of corpus luteum activity, days 14 through 28, right? So follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. However, only 10-15 women have 28-day cycle. Follicular phase, the one that varies. Luteal phase is always 14 days from ovulation to the end of cycle. So if you know when your ovulation is, right, you know 14 days after you start new ovarian cycle. So new primordial follicle start growing into primary follicle, secondary follicle, and oocyte, from primary to secondary oocyte, right? So it's always 14 days for luteal phase. Now, a primordial follicle becomes primary follicle, right? That's our step number one. So where we at? So that's our primordial follicle. It must become primary follicle. So that's what we talking over here. So remember, primordial follicle, we have squamous-like cells surrounding primary oocytes. Now those are squamous or flat cells become cuboidal and oocyte enlarges. Process can take about 1 year. So for, from one follicle to become a primary follicle, it takes time. Now when we have cuboidal cells surrounding primary oocyte, right, we call it primary follicle. Right, so you can see over here the diagram of the ovary, and so where's number one? So here we have primordial follicles. I don't see it anywhere over here. But primordial follicles then develop into primary follicle. And if you look at this histology slide, primordial follicle, those are squamous cells, and here in primary you can see cuboidal cells already, right? Now, follicular cells proliferate, forming stratified epithelium around oocyte. And when more than one layer of cells are present, we don't call it follicular cells anymore. We call it granulosa cells. And a primary follicle is called secondary follicle. And remember the difference also between primary follicle and a secondary follicle. So primary follicle is diploid, so it's 2N. Secondary follicle is already haploid. It's already haploid, right? Because but it did not finish a meiosis, but remember we reduced ploidy in meiosis 1. It's already finished meiosis 1, right? So when it's finished meiosis 1, we form secondary follicle, so that's haploid. Right, so that's important to remember that when we have and again some textbook gonna tell us even one layer of cuboidal cells called granulosa cells. Here in your textbook it says when we have several layers of these cuboidal cells, several layers of cells, they might not be even all cuboidal. But then we call it granulosa cells. But primary follicles then called secondary follicle. Let's look over here. So that's a primary follicle, that's a secondary follicle. Yeah, primary follicle. So primordial follicle, squamous cells, right? Cuboidal cells, primary follicles. Stratified epithelium, several layers of cells, secondary follicle. And now these cells are not called follicular cells anymore. They are called granulosa cells. Where you can imagine granulosa cells have granules, so they're gonna secrete hormones, right? So primary follicles are called secondary follicle. Secondary follicle becomes vesicular follicle. So connective tissue and granulosa cells condense to form theca folliculi. Zona Pellucida is a thick glycoprotein-rich membrane secreted by oocyte encapsulating it. So, so let's see where you have this. Okay, so if you look over here, right, you can see this Zona Pellucida, right, surrounding the oocyte, the secondary oocyte over here, right, and so these cells forming a theca folliculi. So kind of these cells start differentiating, right? So first we start seeing the spaces filled with fluid, and those spaces then that fuse form this antrum. Right now, also oocytes secrete some uh, glycoprotein-rich membrane called Zona Pellucida, and granulosa cells condense form these theca folliculi. Now, when fluids start associating within the follicle, it forms antrum. It's a cavity, and this antrum distinguishes vesicular follicle from previous follicles. So we have pre-antral and antral follicles. So antrum continues to expand with fluid isolating oocyte with surrounding granulosa cells called corona radiata. And when follicle is full size, it bulges from external ovary surface and it's ready to be ovulated. Right, so let's see our diagram again. I think this is a good diagram that show us what's happened with these follicle cells, right? So again, the follicle cells, squamous, one layer, then it's primordial follicle. The cuboidal, still one layer, they're primary follicle. We have many layers of cells surrounding oocyte, we call it secondary follicle. Now, something gonna happen with these cells making cells that make follicle, because here we have follicular cells, right? Here we have follicular cells. Here we have now cells, we call them granulosa cells. Now these granulosa cells and connective tissue, they condense forming this theca folliculi. So that's a theca folliculi. So it's condensed connective tissue and granulosa cells. Some granulosa cells still surrounding our oocyte, and it's called corona radiata. And also we have this glycoprotein layer surrounding oocyte that called zona pellucida. So you can just see how the cells, follicular cells, differentiate into different structure. Follicular cells became granulosa cells, then they became theca folliculi. Some of them became corona radiata, right? And plus we have a protein-rich layer called zona pellucida surrounding the oocyte. Hope it all makes sense, right? Okay. Now, so when the follicle is full size, it bulges, right? So you have ovary and then you have like a little bulge over here, and it's ready to be ovulated. Now, during follicular phase, and we are talking right now about this follicular phase, several vesicular follicles are stimulated to grow. And this growth is triggered by follicle stimulating hormone. So FSH goes up and several vesicular follicles start to grow. But then FSH level drops around midline of follicular phase, and this causes all the follicle to degenerate, and only one follicle survives that is called dominant follicle, right? Only one atrial follicle that is called dominant follicle is selected to continue the development and then ovulation. How dominant follicle is chosen is still uncertain, right? But that's why we usually ovulate only one or two oocytes, right? So we don't ovulate, we don't have too many of the functional uh, uh, cells, right, to be fertilized, right? Because we our body really can support like one or two embryos, 3 years, right? But not multiple. We don't usually give multiple births very often. That makes sense, right? So one vesicular or atrial follicle is chosen, became dominant follicle. And why only one is chosen? Because FSH level drops, and this pretty much destroys all the other follicles. So primary oocyte of dominant follicle completes meiosis 1 to form meiosis to form secondary oocyte and a polar body. Granulosa cells then send signal to oocyte, causing it to stop at metaphase 2. So now in a dominant follicle, we still have primary oocyte, and now the primary oocyte enters meiosis, right? Meiosis 1 forms secondary oocyte, and secondary oocytes arrested in metaphase 2. So it does not finish meiosis 2. Right, so again, back to this diagram. Primordial follicle, primary oocytes, right? Primordial follicle, primary oocytes. Primary follicle, inside is primary oocyte. Secondary follicle, vesicular follicle. What is inside? Primary oocytes. And inside this vesicular follicle, primary oocytes divide, forming secondary oocyte, and it's arrested in metaphase 2. And this is the one that is ovulated, right? So only in a dominant follicle, inside the dominant follicle, we have secondary oocyte. Inside any other follicles, we still have primary oocytes, right? And remember, primary oocytes is 2N, secondary oocyte is 1N. So after this vesicular phase, we have ovulation. So rising level of luteinizing hormone, or LH, causes ovary wall to rupture, expelling secondary oocyte with its corona radiata to peritoneal cavity. 1 or 2% of ovulation release more than one secondary oocyte, which, if fertilized, result in fraternal twins. Identical twins result from fertilization of one oocyte and then separation of daughter cells. So after ovulation, we have luteal phase of ovarian cycle, because we don't have follicle anymore. Instead of follicle, we have corpus luteum. So after ovulation, ruptured follicle collapses, entrance fills with clotted blood, and it's referred to as corpus hemorrhagicum, will eventually be absorbed. Remaining granulosa cells and internal sickle cells enlarge to form corpus luteum. Corpus luteum secretes progesterone and some estrogen. If no pregnancy occurs, corpus luteum degenerates into corpus albicans in 10 days. Luteolytic or ischemic phase lasts 2-3 days of luteal phase when endometrium begins to erode. So if pregnancy occurs, then corpus luteum produces hormones that sustain pregnancy until placenta takes over at about 3 months. So after ovulation, when secondary oocyte is ovulated, two things can happen, right? Either oocyte will be fertilized by sperm, or it will not be fertilized, right? If it's fertilized, then possibly pregnancy will occur. So if pregnancy occurs, corpus luteum survives for 3 months, and it's producing estrogen and progesterone and some estrogen. If no pregnancy occurs, then luteal phase only lasts 14 days, right? And that's it. And the corpus luteum degenerates, right? So no pregnancy, corpus luteum becomes corpus albicans, and then degenerate. Pregnancy occurs, it survives for 3 months, and it produces progesterone that sustains pregnancy. Okay, now after we kind of have an idea of this cycle, right? So that was our ovarian cycle: follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. So again, go over what happened with the germ cell, right, with the gamete, what happened with follicle, what happened with follicle after ovulation, right, what happened with this corpus luteum. Now we're going to discuss how this process is regulated, right? So hormonal regulation of ovarian cycle. So hormonal interaction during ovarian cycle. So we have GnRH. So this is gonadotropin releasing hormone by hypothalamus that stimulate uh, FSH and LH secretion from anterior pituitary. So hypothalamus, anterior pituitary secrete FSH, LH. FSH and LH stimulate follicle to grow, mature, and secrete sex hormones. FSH stimulate granulosa cells to release estrogen. NLH stimulates sickle cells to produce androgen that granulosa cells converts to estrogen. So we have two major hormones, the same as we have for male reproductive system, FSH and LH. FSH stimulates granulosa cells, LH stimulates sickle cells, that granulosa cells differentiate into sickle cells. So granulosa cells secrete estrogen, sickle cells secrete androgen that converted to estrogen by granulosa cells. So pretty much follicle secretes what? Estrogen, right? Follicle secrete estrogen. So here you can see hypothalamus, GnRH, FSH, LH, FSH stimulate the granulosa cells, LH sickle cells, but the overall event is increased level of estrogen, right? Also, when we have when estrogen level go high, it's actually gives this negative feedback to hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, right? So that's decrease the secretion of FSH and LH. So we already have high level of estrogen, right? Also, granulosa cells secrete inhibin that also inhibit hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Now, when estrogen level goes up, right, it stimulates follicle to mature, form this vesicular follicle, right? So that give us a positive feedback. Now we have follicle already matured, right? It's became ready for ovulation. Primary oocyte continue meiosis became secondary oocyte. So this follicle is ready to ovulate its oocyte. So now this stimulate like a large output of or surge of LH, right? So follicle is ready, LH goes up, LH stimulate ovulation, right? So follicle, high estrogen level, you can imagine that this follicle is really has a lot of cells, granulosa cells, so lots of estrogen, surge of LH, ovulation, and now when we have ruptured follicle, now we have corpus luteum. Corpus luteum secrete progesterone mostly, so estrogen level drops, right? And this inhibit hypothalamus, so we decrease the release of FSH and LH, right? Because the oocyte is ovulated, we don't need to start this cycle right away. We need to give this secondary oocyte chance to be fertilized, right? And grow into embryo. So pregnancy hopefully will happen. So we want to inhibit release of FSH and LH for some time, for 14 days, and see what's going to happen with the secondary oocyte. And if it's fertilized, if we have a zygote and it start developing into embryo, right? We don't need new follicle to grow and mature, right? Only if it's not fertilized, right? Corpus luteum for 14 days secrete progesterone, all right, and so it's inhibit and then it degenerate and cycle starts all over, right? The very, just beautiful regulation of these processes. So negative feedback inhibits gonadotropin release. So increasing level of plasma estrogen level exert negative feedback inhibition on FSH and LH release. And not only estrogen, right? And progesterone as well. Estrogen and progesterone and inhibin. Right? So only dominant, this is before. It's actually, this actually is the one when estrogen is still high. So when estrogen is still very, very high, right, then it's inhibit the release of FSH and LH, and it drops the level of FSH and LH. So this drop, only dominant follicle can withstand this drop of FSH, and other developing follicles deteriorate, right? So back over here. So gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? FSH, LH. And what it does, it's actually stimulates this follicle to grow. Follicle is growing bigger. We have more and more these granulosa cells. We have more and more these sickle cells. We have more and more estrogen, right? Estrogen is really high. But what estrogen does when it's really high, it's inhibit release of FSH and LH. And this is when most of the follicles just dies and only one follicle survive. Because when we decrease FSH, only one follicle that will be dominant follicle can handle it, and only one follicle grow, right? Now, after this follicle is grow, became again large, lots of granulosa cells, sickle cells, right? So estrogen level goes up one more time, right? And it's caused a surge of LH. And surge of LH cause ovulation. After ovulation, all these granulosa cells became corpus luteum cells, and they secrete progesterone and inhibin and a little bit estrogen still, but not that much. And again, and then we inhibit this process, right? So so that was negative feedback. So negative feedback of estrogen level goes high, and it's inhibit release of FSH, and this allow only dominant follicle to continue its development. But when estrogen goes up, it's also shows positive feedback, not only negative, but for positive feedback on gonadotropin release. So estrogen level continues to rise as a result of continued release by dominant follicle now. When level reach a critical value, a brief positive feedback occurs on brain, and anterior pituitary triggers LH surge, luteinizing hormone surge. Luteinizing surge triggers ovulation and formation of the corpus luteum. Surge triggers ovulation. Luteinizing hormone surge triggers primary oocytes to complete meiosis 1 to become secondary oocytes. Secondary oocytes then enters meiosis 2, continuing on to metaphase 2. Shortly after ovulation, estrogen level declines, right? LH transforms ruptured follicles into corpus luteum. LH stimulates corpus luteum to secrete progesterone and some estrogen almost immediately. Progesterone helps maintain stratum functionalis of the uterus and maintain pregnancy if it occurs. If no fertilization occurs, corpus luteum degenerate when LH levels start to fall, causes a sharp decrease in estrogen and progesterone, which in turn and blockage of FSH and LH, causing cycle to start all over again. So oocyte is actually activated 12 months prior to ovulation, but matures 14 days before ovulation. Okay, so far, and we already spent like 39 minutes, we were talking about ovarian cycle, right? So ovarian cycle, what happened with primary oocyte, what happened with a follicle, right? What hormones are involved? Well, the hormones that are involved, let's see, they are right here. So the hormones that are involved is gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? FSH, LH, that stimulate follicle to grow and secrete estrogen, right? So follicle grows, estrogen goes up, 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 and then estrogen inhibits the release of FSH and LH. So it's negative feedback. Well, we have several follicles that start to grow, and all of a sudden, FSH level drops. Then only one follicle survives. So that's a negative feedback. Well, the one follicle that survive now continue to grow, and start producing now again more and more estrogen. And this time, for a short period of time, the estrogen exhibits positive feedback, very quick positive feedback, and we have surge of LH, right? So negative feedback, no FSH, no LH or low amount. Positive feedback, surge of LH, and ovulation. So surge of LH causes ovulation. Now, after ovulation, what happened with estrogen level? Decreases, right? Because we don't even have follicle anymore. We have the corpus luteum. So estrogen goes down, right? But progesterone and estrogen and inhibin, progesterone and inhibin, they goes up because corpus luteum start to secrete progesterone. Progesterone triggers the uterus, right? Progesterone triggers the uterus, and it also has a negative feedback on release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? So when corpus luteum degenerates, right, we don't have any of these hormones, so we don't have this negative feedback anymore, and the cycle starts all over again, right? I hope I didn't confuse you too much. Okay, so that was ovarian cycle. So what happened within ovaries? At the same time, we have the second cycle over here, right? That is called uterine cycle or menstrual cycle. So these changes happen within uterus. So a cyclic series of changes in endometrium that occurs in response on fluctuating ovarian hormone level. Three phases: menstrual phase, proliferative or pre-ovulatory phase, and secretory or post-ovulatory phase. So menstrual, proliferative, secretory, and another name for proliferative is pre-ovulatory, and for secretory, post-ovulatory. So day 1 through 5, menstrual phase, stratum functionalis. So that's a endometrium, right, inside the uterus, detaches from uterine wall and shed. And this is what we call menstrual flow. So menstrual flow, blood and tissue lasts about 3 to 5 days. By day 5, growing ovarian follicle start to produce more estrogen. So, okay, so when you have menstruation, right, females, when females have menstruation, right, when it's about day 5, at the same time within ovary, follicle is growing, right? Because look, no pregnancy, right? It's already menstruation. So the stratum functionalis is detached and shed. So no pregnancy. Now your body already knows no pregnancy, so it's time to produce new oocyte, right? Maybe this time pregnancy will happen, right? So menstrual flow at the same time within the ovary, follicle is growing. When follicle is growing, it starts secreting estrogen, right? Follicles, these granulosa cells, they secrete estrogen. So estrogen start going up. Day 6-14, proliferative or pre-ovulatory phase. Rising estrogen level prompts generation of new stratum functionalis level. So estrogen goes up from follicle. Then inside the uterus, new stratum functionalis is growing. As layer thickens, glands enlarge and spiral arteries increase in numbers. Okay, now since out normally sick. Okay, also the increased level of estrogen makes the cervical mucus very thin, right? Usually it's pretty thick, but now it's became thin to facilitate sperm passage because the cervix, right? So you have cervix and you have uterus. Cervix is covered by mucus, and usually this mucus is very thick and it doesn't allow sperm to enter the uterus. But now this mucus became thin that makes easier for sperm to enter uterus because sperm need to enter uterus and fallopian tubes, and fertilization usually happen within fallopian tubes, right? So what happened in proliferative phase? New stratum functionalis growing, a cervical mucus became thin, glands within the stratum functionalis enlarged, spiral arteries increase in number. So we growing this endometrium. It became rich with blood supply, right? Hopefully for pregnancy to occur. Now, ovulation occurs at the end of proliferative phase on day 14. So 6-14, proliferative phase, and at day 14, ovulation. Now, ovulation occurs, uterus should be ready, right? So day 15-28, secretory or post-ovulatory phase. Endometrium prepares for embryo to implant. Rising progesterone level from corpus luteum prompts endometrial glands to enlarge and secrete nutrients into uterine cavity. Second, now we thicken the mucus because we don't want any more sperm because we gave it opportunity to enter the uterus, right? Now mucus became thick again that plug and block entry of more sperm, pathogens, or debris, right? Now, so we have proliferative phase because estrogen level goes up. We have secretory phase because now progesterone level goes up from corpus luteum. If fertilization does not occur, then corpus luteum inside the ovaries degenerate, progesterone level falls, and this causes spiral arteries to kink and spasm. Endometrial cells die and glands regress, blood vessels fragment, and functional layer sloughs off. Uterine cycle starts all over again on the first day of menstruation, right? So, and if we look at this diagram over here, you can see how the ovarian cycle, so here's ovarian cycle, and how uterine cycle, how they match, right? What happened? Because look, when we have menstrual flow means pregnancy didn't happen. If pregnancy didn't happen, we start all over. Inside the ovaries, we start all over again. So the follicles start to grow. Follicles start to grow, estrogen level goes up, right? Now here we have our dominant follicle, we have ovulation. At the same time, in the uterus, everything is prepared. So proliferative phase is, when the blood vessels are growing, glands develop, right? So that's getting ready for ovulation. Now ovulation happened, we have secretory phase. So glands start secrete nutrients, right? Very rich blood supply, because this ovulated oocyte, right? Hopefully will be fertilized and implant inside the uterus. Right now, why we still have all these arteries and glands secreting, right, enlarging? Because we have high level of progesterone secreted by corpus luteum. Now, if pregnancy didn't happen, degeneration of corpus luteum, right, progesterone falls, and fall in progesterone level cause this stratum functionalis to shed again and start all over. So you can see estrogen level goes, drops. This is our surge when estrogen give us positive feedback on LH. You see how LH goes up and ovulation happens, right? And then it's kind of, because corpus luteum secrete estrogen as well, but it secretes a lot of progesterone. So you see, we don't almost have no progesterone until ovulation, and then progesterone goes up when we have corpus luteum. And this progesterone keeps endometrium attached and promotes all these glands to secrete nutrients inside the cavity and blood vessels to stay attached. Right? When progesterone drops, the corpus functionalis shed off. Okay. Now, extremely stenosis physical activity can delay menarche in girls and disrupt normal menstrual cycle in adult women. That means that if a girl does too much of the exercises, it might affect her menstrual cycle. It can cause amenorrhea or cessation of menstruation. So no menstruation because of physical activities. Effects of estrogen and progesterone. So estrogens promote oogenesis and follicle growth in ovary, exert anabolic effect on female reproductive tract, induce secondary sex characteristic, growth of breast, increase deposit of subcutaneous fat in hips and breast, widening and lightening of pelvis. Progesterone works with estrogen to establish and regulate uterine cycle, promote changes in the cervical mucus, effects of placental progesterone during pregnancy, helps prepare breast for lactation. Okay, so now we cover both ovarian cycle and uterine cycle. Hopefully you guys now have an idea how LH and FSH work. So LH and FSH, they affect ovaries. Then ovaries secrete, those granulosa cells and Zika cells. They secrete estrogen, right? Now, corpus luteum secrete estrogen and progesterone, but target cells for estrogen and progesterone now uterus. Okay, and the last part of this chapter is very briefly about development, right? So let's see human developmental stages after fertilization. So fertilization is fusion of ovum and sperm on day one. Actually, it's not really ovum, it's a secondary oocyte, right? So secondary oocyte and sperm, remember, and then secondary oocyte continues meiosis 2. Now, morula is a solid ball of cells after 3 days. Then it's developed into blastocyst. It's a hollow ball of cells after 5 days. Trophoblast forms early embryo, fetal membranes and placenta after 5 to 7 days. Embryo is developing human from fertilization to 8th week of pregnancy. After 8th week of pregnancy, we call it fetus. That's a developing human from 9 weeks of pregnancy to birth at around 40 weeks. Neonate is newborn baby from birth to 28 days old, and infant, baby or young child ages less than 1 year, right? So that's kind of just terminology. So you know what morula, blastocyst, trophoblast, embryo, fetus is. So 3 phases of human development: pre-embryonic phase, embryonic phase, and fetal phase. Right, so you see here we have embryo. So everything before will be pre-embryonic phase. Now embryo from week 8 to from fertilization to week 8. So that will be embryonic phase, and then fetal phase from week 8 till the birth. Right, so pre-embryonic, embryonic. So kind of from, well, pre-embryonic 7 days, then embryonic about 8 weeks, and then from 8 weeks fetal phase. Okay, so here we have zygote. Zygote is the first, that's a fertilized cell, right? When egg and sperm combine, we form zygote. So 36 hours, we have 2-cell embryo, then 4-cell embryo, then 8-cell embryo. So it takes about 12 hours. Then morula, and then blastocyst. So morula is a ball of cells, solid ball of cells, excuse me, and blastocyst is already a hollow ball, right? The blastocyst implants into endometrial lining of the uterus by the end of the first week. So that's take 1 week, right? So when we have blastocyst, and after 1 week, blastocyst already implants itself in the wall of the uterus. Right, so here we have zygote. They didn't show the morula here, but here we have blastocyst, and then blastocyst implants itself. Right, so over here, ovary, right, ovulation, corpus luteum, fertilization, and then day 1, right, 2 cells embryo. Here you can see morula, blastocyst, and that we called trophoblast, and then we have implantation. Here, just very quickly, you can compare the chicken egg with the human egg, and of course it seems like very different, but actually we have the same lining, right? We have chorion, right? We have amnion, the sac. We have embryo inside, allantois, that's another, this sac for waste products in chicken, but in human it became umbilical cord, yolk sac, right? So in human we just have, so we still have chorion and amnion, but this allantoid and yolk sac, they fuse together forming umbilical cord, and then placenta develops. So we have fetal portion of the placenta and maternal portion of the placenta. So pre-embryonic phase, 1st to 3rd weeks, placenta develops. I told you embryo. Okay, so I was wrong. I'm sorry. It says embryo here 5 to 7 days, right? Then it's developed into embryo, but embryonic phase is actually to the 3rd week. So first 3 weeks is still pre-embryonic phase. So I apologize. So pre-embryonic phase is not all this stuff that happened, right? But actually, so embryo, so trophoblast forms embryo within 7 days, right? But it's still 2 more weeks, it's pre-embryonic stage. That doesn't make that much sense, but this is how it is. Right, so pre-embryonic phase, 1st to 3rd week, placenta develops during the 2nd week, fetal portion of placenta, blood vessels in chorionic sac, maternal portion of the placenta develops, right? Mother and fetal blood do not connect. So I guess why they call it still pre-embryonic phase, because we're still in the process of development of the placenta and umbilical cord, right? So here you can see how we have maternal arteries and we have fetal arteries, and they never really mixed, but that's form placenta. So placenta has two parts, uh, embryonic part and maternal part. Okay, then still in pre-embryonic phase, we have differentiation of the inner cell mass into three types of germinal tissue. Um, so we form first three germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And please pay attention over here, because you will have question like this on your exam. From endoderm, we actually develop lining cells of alveolar cells, thyroid cells, digestive cells. So this will be part of the epithelial cells. Epithelial cells develop from all these three layers, right? But from mesoderm, you form muscle cells, right? And connective tissue cells. From ectoderm, we develop skin cells or epidermis, neurons of the brain, and pigment cells, right? So endoderm will be internal layer, right? Ectoderm, external layer, and mesoderm will be middle layer that develop muscle cells and connective tissue, right? Endoderm will be epithelial cells, but inside, like lining of digestive tract and endocrine glands, also lining of your lungs in alveolar, because that's inside. So it's epithelial cells, but inside. Ectoderm, epithelial cells, and neurons. And mesoderm, muscles and connective tissue. Right? Makes sense? Okay, on the third week of development, development of neural tube, secretion of chorionic gonadotropin hormone that stimulates mother ovaries to secrete progesterone through the pregnancy. And this chorionic gonadotropin hormone, or CHH, is used for test for pregnancy. Right, so that's the end of pre-embryonic phase, 3 weeks, and we have development of a neural cord, right, and secretion of the CGH, or chorion gonadotropin hormone. And chorion is this is a cover, it's a lining of the fetus, right, of the embryo, I'm sorry, of the embryo. Okay, so that's a chorion, and chorion starts secreting CGH that stimulate ovary to continue secreting progesterone, because we need progesterone. If we have drop in progesterone level, then endometrium, this stratum functionalis, will shed off, and we will not be able to support embryo. Right, so then we moving to the embryonic phase, so 4 to 8 weeks, so after months, right, mostly. So that's the most critical period. If something goes wrong, baby continues develop with serious deformities. So if something goes wrong in pre-embryonic phase, then it will result in an abortion. If so just embryo just dies. In embryonic phase, if something goes wrong, then the embryo continue to develop. So 4th week, we have development of brain, 3 region, forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, development of beating heart. 8 week, still embryonic phase, digits of hands and feet, further development of eyes, ears, nose, bones begin to calcify, development of deciduous teeth, right? So here you can see embryo at 8 weeks that already look like fetus here. And then fetal phase, 9th week to birth. So 3rd month, sex can be determined, eyelids are formed, nail begins to develop, kidney begins to produce urine. 5th month, feel baby movement. 6 months, pulmonary alveoli begin to develop. Actually, you see the respiratory system, one of the last system to develop. Now 7th month, now we're in a fetal phase, right? So we starting with the 9th week of birth, we're in a fetal phase. 7 months, fetus rotates into cephalic presentation, deposition of subcutaneous fat, and fetus is capable of surviving. So after 7 months, fetus is capable of surviving. Um, you know, the the only problem might be with respiratory system, because this is the one that develops, this is the system that develops like only on a 6 months. So that's why premature babies very often have problem with breathing and production of surfactant in their alveoli of their lungs. But fetus capable of surviving. Now 8 and 9 months, baby just becomes more chubby, so they just continue to depositing this subcutaneous fat. Testes begin to descend into scrotum, and 10 months is already post-term, right? Okay, I see that's the last one, right? So you can just appreciate the development of the embryo and fetus. Again, we do not cover this development much in details, because it would take, you know, another very long lecture to do it. Just brief introduction, so you guys are familiar with some terminology and some basic processes that happens during pre-embryonic, embryonic, and fetal phases. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. So again, it was physiology of the female reproductive system. Thank you for watching, and I hope it was helpful.